The champagne flutes clinked around me in a symphony of crystalline mockery as I watched Marcus Henderson, my former senior partner, desperately try to salvage what remained of Henderson and Associates. 3 months ago, I had sat in this exact conference room, listening to him explain why Rebecca Martinez, 26 years old, 2 years out of law school, and possessing a Harvard pedigree that apparently trumped my 8 years of relentless dedication, deserved the partnership track promotion that should have been mine. Now, as I signed the final contract that would transfer his three largest clients to my firm, the mechanical indifference in my voice surprised even me. The transition will be seamless, I assured Mrs. Whitmore, whose family trust had generated 40% of Henderson's revenue last quarter. Davidson Legal will provide the same level of service you've come to expect, with the added benefit of personalized attention from a founding partner. Marcus's face had drained of color 3 shades ago, somewhere between the moment I'd introduced myself as CEO of Davidson Legal and when Mrs. Whitmore mentioned that her nephew's tech startup would also be moving their corporate legal work to my firm. The sickening thud of realization hit him as each contract signature sealed his fate, the same fate he had sealed for me with his careless dismissal of my worth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story doesn't begin with my triumph. It begins with the systematic erosion of my professional soul, one overlooked contribution at a time. 8 years earlier, I had walked into Henderson and Associates with the kind of naive optimism that only a freshly minted law school graduate could possess. The firm occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower, its mahogany-paneled offices and leather-bound legal tomes promising the kind of prestigious career I'd dreamed about since I was 12 years old, watching my single mother struggle to navigate a legal system that seemed designed to crush people like us. Marcus Henderson was different then, or perhaps I was simply too eager to succeed to see him clearly. He was 42, charismatic in that effortless way that comes with old money and older connections, and he possessed an uncanny ability to make you feel like the most important person in the room when his attention focused on you. During my interview, he'd leaned back in his chair and smiled that practiced smile that would later become as familiar to me as my own reflection. "Sarah Davidson," he'd said, my resume spread before him like tea leaves waiting to be read. "Top 5% of your class at State Law Review, mock trial champion. Impressive, but I'm more interested in something else I see here." He'd tapped the paper with his Mont Blanc pen. "You worked your way through school, 2 jobs, sometimes 3. That tells me something about your character that grades never could." I had felt seen, valued, chosen. The irony would become bitter years later, but in that moment, I believed I had found not just a job, but a mentor who understood that success meant more than birthright and privilege. The first year had been a whirlwind of 70-hour weeks, client dinners where I mostly listened and learned, and the intoxicating rush of building something meaningful. I threw myself into every case with the fervor of someone who knew that excellence was not optional. It was survival. My research was meticulous, my briefs were airtight, and my ability to connect with clients from all walks of life quickly became one of the firm's most valuable assets. "You have a gift," Marcus told me during my first performance review, sliding a bonus check across his desk that was larger than anything I dared hope for. "You make people trust you. In this business, that's worth more than a dozen Harvard degrees." I had glowed under his praise, storing his words like precious stones in a vault of validation I hadn't realized I'd been building. This was what success felt like, being recognized not just for what I could do, but for who I was. The second year brought more responsibility. I was handling client meetings independently, drafting complex contracts, and fielding calls from nervous executives who somehow always seemed to reach out after hours. Marcus began introducing me to his personal network, bringing me to charity galas and professional conferences where deals were made over drinks and relationships were currency more valuable than gold. "Sarah is the future of this firm," he would say, his hand on my shoulder as he introduced me to judges, city council members, and Fortune 500 executives. "She's got that rare combination of brilliant legal mind and genuine heart. Can't teach that." I believed him. More dangerously, I trusted him. By my 3rd year, I was generating substantial revenue for the firm. The Whitmore Family Trust came to me through a referral from a former classmate whose mother sat on the hospital board with Mrs. Whitmore. When I successfully restructured their charitable giving to save them nearly $2 million in tax liability, While maximizing their philanthropic impact, Marcus had been effusive in his praise. "This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that sets us apart," he'd announced at the monthly partners meeting, where I was still introduced as one of our most promising associates, despite doing work that at any other firm would have qualified me for senior associate status at minimum. The pattern established itself with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. I would land the client, build the relationship, create the strategy, execute the work, and Marcus would present the results to the partnership while I sat quietly, my contributions acknowledged with the kind of perfunctory gratitude usually reserved for efficient office equipment. Year 4 brought the Maxwell Industries account, a mid-sized manufacturing company whose owner, Janet Maxwell, had specifically requested to work with me after hearing about my work from Mrs. Whitmore. The account was worth $300,000 annually, and my successful defense of their product liability case, a case Marcus had initially considered unwinnable, not only saved them 8 figures in potential damages, but established our firm as a serious player in corporate defense. I couldn't have done it without Sarah's groundwork, Marcus had told the partners, which was his way of acknowledging that I had done everything while he had attended precisely 2 meetings and offered commentary that was more hindrance than help. Year 5 was when the first crack appeared in my carefully constructed faith in Marcus's integrity. Tyler Brennan joined the firm as a lateral hire from a White Shoe New York practice. Tyler was everything I wasn't: male, connected, possessed of that particular brand of Ivy League confidence that opened doors before he even knocked. He was also competent enough to avoid being obviously incompetent, which made his rapid ascension through the firm's hierarchy all the more galling. Tyler brings a level of sophistication to our practice that will really elevate our profile, Marcus explained when Tyler was made senior associate after just 18 months, a promotion that had taken me 3.5 years to achieve despite bringing in twice the revenue. "What about Sarah?" asked Linda Kowalski, the firm's only female partner, and the closest thing I had to an advocate in the boys' club that constituted Henderson's leadership. "She's been here longer, has a stronger book of business, and, frankly, better instincts with difficult clients." Marcus had smiled, that practice smile, the one I was beginning to recognize as his default response when he was about to say something he knew was fundamentally unfair. "Sarah is invaluable, absolutely. But Tyler has experience with the kind of high-stakes litigation that we're trying to build toward. Sometimes it's not just about tenure, it's about strategic positioning." Strategic positioning. I had turned those words over in my mind for weeks, trying to decode what they meant in any language other than, "Tyler is a man with connections, and you are not." The 6th year brought Rebecca Martinez, fresh from Harvard with a clerkship under her belt and the kind of polished confidence that money and privilege tend to produce. Rebecca was undeniably bright, I won't diminish that, but her arrival coincided with a subtle shift in how my own contributions were acknowledged and valued. Where my client relationship skills had once been praised as intuitive and natural, they were now described as soft skills in partnership meetings, as if the ability to earn trust and generate loyalty was somehow less valuable than Tyler's ability to cite obscure case law or Rebecca's talent for crafting academic-sounding briefs that said remarkably little in remarkably many words. "We need to think about building our intellectual capital," Marcus had explained when Rebecca was assigned to the Whitmore account alongside me, ostensibly to learn from Sarah's client management approach, but functionally to begin inserting herself into the relationship I had spent years cultivating. I watched her during those early meetings with Mrs. Whitmore, studying the way she positioned herself slightly forward when speaking, how she referenced her Harvard professors and federal court clerkship in ways that seemed casual but were clearly calculated. Mrs. Whitmore was polite but cool toward Rebecca, consistently directing her questions and comments to me. But I could see Rebecca taking mental notes on every interaction, mapping the relationship like a general studying enemy territory. Year 7 was when the Whisper campaign began. Nothing overt, nothing I could point to and declare definitively unfair, but a systematic erosion of my professional standing that was as effective as it was subtle. Suddenly, my trial victories were attributed to strong team efforts, while Tyler's wins were brilliant strategic thinking. My client relationships were wonderful rapport, while Rebecca's new business development was sophisticated market positioning. The most insidious part was how Marcus began to position my strengths as limitations. My connection with working class clients became Sarah's great with the mid market stuff, as if empathy and trust were somehow incompatible with high dollar accounts. My preference for thorough preparation over grandstanding was characterized as careful and methodical, delivered in the tone one might use to describe a reliable but uninspiring piece of office furniture. Sarah's incredibly solid became Marcus's standard description of me, and I began to understand that solid was the kiss of death in a profession that rewarded flash over substance, connections over competence, and pedigree over performance. By year 8, the writing was on the wall in letters large enough for everyone to read except, apparently, me. I had been so focused on proving my worth through excellence that I had failed to recognize that worth in Marcus's ecosystem was predetermined by factors I could never change and wouldn't compromise to acquire. The partnership meeting where my fate was sealed was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. I had spent weeks preparing my presentation, documenting not just my financial contributions to the firm, which exceeded those of 3 current partners, but my role in building the firm's reputation in several practice areas. I had testimonial letters from clients, revenue projections showing the growth trajectory of my accounts, and a detailed business plan for expanding our services to the nonprofit sector, where my connections could open doors that had been previously closed to Henderson and Associates. I arrived at the office that morning with the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing your future hangs in the balance. I had rehearsed my presentation until I could deliver it in my sleep, anticipated every possible question, and prepared responses that balanced confidence with appropriate deference to the partnership structure. Linda found me in my office at 7:30, her face bearing an expression I had never seen before, something between sympathy and anger, with an underlying current of disgust that made my stomach clench with premature dread. "Sarah," she said, closing the door behind her and taking a seat across from my desk, "I need to talk to you before the meeting." The careful neutrality in her voice told me everything I needed to know, but I let her say the words anyway because some truths need to be spoken aloud to become real. "Marcus has decided to offer the partnership track to Rebecca." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that was only just beginning to burn. I felt something inside me crack. Not break, not yet, but develop the kind of hairline fracture that would eventually bring down the entire structure. "Rebecca," I repeated, my voice surprisingly steady. "Rebecca, who has been here for 2 years. Rebecca, who has never brought in a client independently. Rebecca, who has never tried a case to verdict." Linda's jaw tightened. Marcus's reasoning is that Rebecca represents the future direction of the firm. Her Harvard background and federal court experience position us to attract more sophisticated clients and higher value matters. More sophisticated than the Whitmore Trust? More sophisticated than Maxwell Industries? More sophisticated than the 3 nonprofit boards I serve on that have brought us 7 figures in legal work? "Sarah, don't!" The word came out sharper than I intended, cutting through Linda's attempt at consolation like a blade through tissue. "Don't try to make this make sense because it doesn't. Don't try to soften it because it can't be softened. And please don't insult my intelligence by pretending this decision was based on merit." Linda was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against my desk in a rhythm that sounded like a funeral march. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had fought battles like this before and lost everyone. "You're right. It's not fair, it's not based on merit, and it's not the decision I would have made. But Marcus controls 4 votes on the partnership committee, and I only have 1. What was his actual reasoning? Not the corporate speak, not the strategic positioning bullshit. What did he actually say? Linda's hesitation told me the truth would be worse than anything I had imagined. He said that Rebecca has the right profile for the direction he wants to take the firm. Young, polished, connected to the right networks. He said that while you're undeniably talented, you represent the firm's past rather than its future. The firm's past. 8 years of my life reduced to an outdated business model that was being gracefully phased out in favor of something newer, shinier, and apparently more marketable to the kind of clients Marcus wanted to attract. "There's more," Linda continued, and I could see her wrestling with whether to share whatever additional knife Marcus had chosen to twist in my professional corpse. "He also said that your client relationships, while strong, are too dependent on personal connection. He wants partnerships that are more institutionally based, less likely to follow a single attorney if they were to leave. The irony was breathtaking. Marcus was essentially admitting that my clients were loyal to me personally, which should have been the strongest possible argument for making me a partner. Instead, he was using that loyalty as a reason to deny me partnership, apparently calculating that my clients would never actually leave the firm regardless of how I was treated. The miscalculation in that reasoning would become apparent soon enough. I sat in that partnership meeting, listening to Marcus announce Rebecca's promotion with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for lottery winners and new parents. Rebecca herself managed to strike the perfect balance between humility and confidence, thanking the partners for their faith in her while outlining her vision for expanding the firm's appellate practice and corporate governance services. She was good, I'll give her that. Polished in a way that comes from never having to question whether you belong in a room, confident in a way that comes from having every door opened for you since birth. As she spoke about building on the firm's existing client relationships while developing new revenue streams, I realized that she was essentially describing taking over my work while positioning it as innovation rather than appropriation. Sarah has been an incredible mentor, Rebecca said, her smile directed at me with what I'm sure she believed was genuine warmth. I've learned so much from watching how she builds trust with clients and develops creative solutions to complex problems. I hope to bring that same client-centered approach to the partnership level. The translation was clear. She had studied my methods, identified what made them effective, and would now implement them herself while I remained at the associate level, available for consultation but not compensation. I smiled and nodded and said all the appropriate things about being excited to work with Rebecca in her new role. I congratulated her with enthusiasm that probably sounded genuine to everyone except Linda, who kept shooting me concerned glances throughout the meeting. I asked thoughtful questions about her plans and offered support for her transition into partnership-level responsibilities. And somewhere in the middle of that performance, I felt the final crack in my foundation split wide open, not into destruction, but into crystalline clarity. Marcus Henderson had made a fundamental error in judgment. He had assumed that my loyalty to the firm was unconditional, that my investment in the work we did together meant I would accept any treatment as long as I could continue practicing law under the Henderson and Associates banner. He had mistaken my professionalism for passivity, my dedication for desperation. He was about to learn the difference. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a bottle of wine and a yellow legal pad, making lists. On one side, I wrote down every client relationship I had built, every source of revenue I had generated, every professional connection I had cultivated during my 8 years with the firm. On the other side, I wrote down what Henderson and Associates had given me in return. A salary that was competitive but not generous, experience that was valuable but not unique, and a partnership track that had apparently never been intended for me at all. The mathematics were stark. I had generated millions in revenue for Marcus Henderson's firm while being compensated like a well-performing employee, rather than the business development engine I actually was. I had built relationships that he assumed would transfer seamlessly to Rebecca's management, despite the fact that most of my clients had specifically sought me out based on referrals that praised my personal approach to legal services. By midnight, I had filled 17 pages with plans, strategies, and calculations. By 2 a.m., I had researched the legal requirements for starting a practice in our state, identified potential office spaces, and begun drafting a business plan for Davidson Legal Services. By 4 a.m., I had made the decision that would change everything. I gave Marcus 2 months. Not out of any lingering loyalty, but because I needed time to properly plan my exit and ensure that my clients' interests were protected during the transition. I also wanted to observe how Rebecca settled into her new role, partly out of professional curiosity, but mostly to confirm what I already suspected about her capabilities. Rebecca's first month as a partner was illuminating. She possessed all the technical skills necessary to handle complex legal work, but she lacked the intuitive understanding of client psychology that had made my practice so successful. I watched her interact with Mrs. Whitmore during a trust review meeting, delivering perfectly accurate legal advice in language that was precise but cold, comprehensive but utterly lacking in the warmth and reassurance that elderly clients often need when discussing their family's financial future. She seems very knowledgeable, Mrs. Whitmore commented to me after Rebecca left the meeting early to attend a bar association luncheon. But I do miss the way you used to explain things, Sarah. You always made me feel like you understood not just the legal issues, but why they mattered to my family. I smiled and nodded and made appropriate comments about Rebecca's expertise, but I also made mental notes about Mrs. Whitmore's subtle dissatisfaction. Similar notes accumulated over the following weeks as I observed Rebecca's interactions with other clients, each one confirming my growing confidence that my departure would create opportunities rather than obstacles. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to be going through a honeymoon period with his new partner. Rebecca's Harvard credentials opened doors that had previously been closed to the firm, and her connections in the federal court system brought in several white-collar defense cases that carried significant prestige along with substantial fees. Marcus was effusive in his praise during team meetings, frequently noting how Rebecca's elevated profile was helping to position Henderson and Associates as a more sophisticated practice. "This is what strategic growth looks like," he announced during one particularly self-congratulatory staff meeting. "Rebecca's bringing us the kind of institutional clients that will provide stable, long-term revenue streams." I sat in those meetings, watching Marcus bask in his apparent vindication, while Rebecca graciously accepted credit for victories that were as much about timing and luck as they were about her individual capabilities. The federal court cases had come through a former professor who needed a reliable local firm to handle overflow work. Hardly a testament to Rebecca's business development skills, but Marcus seemed determined to interpret every positive development as proof of his wisdom in promoting her over me. During my 8th week of preparation, Linda approached me again, this time with an expression that managed to combine hope and desperation in equal measure. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation after the partnership meeting," she began, settling into the chair across from my desk with the careful deliberation of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "I think I may have found a way to make this situation more equitable." I set down the brief I had been reviewing and gave her my full attention, curious to see what solution she had devised for a problem that had no legal remedy. "Marcus has been so pleased with the revenue from Rebecca's federal court connections that he's talking about expanding the partnership again next year. I think if you can demonstrate continued growth in your practice areas, maybe develop some new institutional clients to complement your existing relationships, you could position yourself for consideration in the next cycle." The kindness in her offer was genuine, and I appreciated that Linda was trying to provide me with a path forward within the existing structure. But she was essentially asking me to perform my way into a partnership that should have already been mine, while competing against candidates who would continue to benefit from Marcus's preferential treatment and the firm's resources. "Linda, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I need you to be honest with me about something." I leaned forward, holding her gaze with the directness that had made me effective in client negotiations. "Do you really believe that Marcus will ever see me as partnership material, regardless of what I accomplish?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers worrying the edge of a legal pad in a gesture that answered my question before she spoke. "I think Marcus has a very specific vision for what he wants the firm to become, and I think that vision may not include the kind of practice you've built here. Because my clients aren't sophisticated enough? Because I don't have Harvard on my resume? Because I actually care about the people I represent instead of just seeing them as revenue streams?" "Because you're not Rebecca," Linda said quietly, and the honesty in her admission was both painful and liberating. That night, I finalized my business plan for Davidson Legal Services. I had identified office space in a converted Victorian downtown, close enough to the courthouse to be convenient, but far enough from Henderson and Associates to avoid any appearance of direct competition. I had researched malpractice insurance, calculated startup costs, and identified the technology platforms I would need to operate independently. Most importantly, I had developed a strategy for transitioning my client relationships in a way that would be legally sound and ethically unassailable. I would not be poaching clients. I would be informing them that I was leaving Henderson and Associates and would be available to continue representing them through my new firm if they chose to make that transition. The distinction mattered both legally and personally. I had built these relationships through years of dedicated service and genuine care for my clients' interests. They were not Henderson's property to be assigned at will. They were professional relationships that existed between the clients and me personally. relationships that I had every right to maintain regardless of my employment status. 3 days before I planned to submit my resignation, Marcus requested a meeting to discuss my professional development goals. The irony of the timing was almost poetic, but I agreed to meet with him, curious to see what insights he might offer about my future, at a firm that had already demonstrated its vision of my place in that future. Marcus's office had always intimidated me slightly. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the antique Persian rug, the wall of legal treatises that seemed to judge anyone who entered with insufficient reverence for the law's complexity. But as I sat across from his mahogany desk that Tuesday afternoon, I felt none of the nervous energy that had characterized our previous meetings about my career trajectory. "Sarah, I wanted to touch base with you about how you're adjusting to the new dynamics in the firm," Marcus began, his tone carrying the kind of carefully practiced concern that politicians use when discussing issues they don't actually care about. "I know the partnership decision was disappointing, but I hope you understand that it reflects strategic considerations rather than any dissatisfaction with your work." I nodded, letting him continue while I cataloged the subtle condescension in his phrasing. My disappointment, as if my reaction to being passed over was an emotional failing rather than a rational response to professional unfairness. "Rebecca has been singing your praises, actually. She's learned a tremendous amount from observing your client interactions, and she's excited about the possibility of collaborating more closely as she grows into her partnership role." Collaboration, another euphemism for me doing the work while she received the credit, the compensation, and the advancement opportunities. "I'm glad Rebecca is finding value in our work together," I said, keeping my voice neutral and professional. "She's certainly brought valuable experience to the firm." "Exactly, and that's what I wanted to discuss with you. I think there are opportunities for you to develop in similar directions, to position yourself for partnership consideration in the future. Rebecca's success with appellate work, for instance, that's an area where you could build additional expertise." Marcus leaned back in his chair, warming to his theme with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was being generous rather than insulting. "I'm thinking we could structure some additional training, maybe a secondment to a federal practice or some CLE courses in constitutional law. Build out your credential set to complement the client relationship skills you've already developed." The assumption underlying his offer was breathtaking in its arrogance. Marcus believed that the problem with my partnership candidacy was a lack of sufficient qualifications, rather than his own biased decision-making process. He was offering to help me become more like Rebecca, apparently unaware that Rebecca's primary qualification for partnership had been Marcus's preference for her background and connections, rather than any particular legal expertise. "That's an interesting suggestion," I said, buying time while I decided how much of my actual thoughts to share. "Can I ask what specific credentials you think I'm lacking? My track record with client development and case management seems pretty strong." Marcus's smile became slightly strained, the expression of someone who had expected gratitude rather than questions. "Oh, absolutely. Your work has been excellent, Sarah. But as the firm grows, we need to think about positioning ourselves for more sophisticated matters. Rebecca's appellate experience, Tyler's litigation background, these are the kinds of specialized skills that differentiate us from the general practice firms. And my work with the Whitmore Trust, the Maxwell Industries Defense, the municipal bond work for the hospital district, those aren't sophisticated enough. They're exactly the kind of solid, reliable work that forms the foundation of any good practice," Marcus said, apparently unaware that he was damning with faint praise. "But we're trying to build toward federal court work, complex commercial litigation, the kind of matters that require a different level of academic preparation." Academic preparation. There it was. The coded language that Marcus used to distinguish between lawyers like Rebecca, whose credentials opened doors, and lawyers like me, whose results spoke for themselves, but apparently in a language that Marcus had chosen not to understand. "I see," I said. And I did see, with the kind of clarity that comes from finally understanding that you've been playing a game where the rules were stacked against you from the beginning. "So you're suggesting that I pursue additional training to position myself for partnership consideration at some future point?" "Exactly. I'm thinking a timeline of maybe 3 to 5 years, depending on how quickly you can develop those additional skill sets. Rebecca's success has shown us what's possible when we combine strong client relationships with cutting-edge legal expertise. 3 to 5 years. Marcus was essentially asking me to spend the next half-decade proving myself worthy of a partnership that Rebecca had received after 2 years, while generating revenue that would fund the firm's operations and growth. He was asking me to subsidize my own continued subordination while competing against candidates who would continue to benefit from his preferential treatment. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus outlining various pathways for my professional development and me nodding thoughtfully while calculating exactly how much revenue I could take with me when I left. By the time I shook his hand and thanked him for his guidance, I had mentally composed my resignation letter and scheduled my first client meetings to discuss transitioning their work to Davidson Legal. Walking back to my office, I felt lighter than I had in months. The burden of trying to prove myself worthy of Marcus's approval had lifted, replaced by the exhilarating prospect of building something that belonged entirely to me. I submitted my resignation the following Monday morning, 2 weeks earlier than I had originally planned. The letter was brief and professional, thanking Marcus for the opportunities he had provided while expressing my intention to start my own practice. I offered to ensure a smooth transition of my cases and to cooperate fully with any client retention efforts Henderson and Associates chose to pursue. Marcus's reaction was immediate and illuminating. Within an hour of receiving my letter, he was in my office, the door closed behind him, and his expression cycling through confusion, anger, and something that looked remarkably like panic. "Sarah, what is this about? If this is a reaction to our conversation last week, I think you may have misunderstood my suggestions. I wasn't saying you weren't qualified for partnership. I was outlining a pathway to strengthen your candidacy." I looked up from the files I was organizing, struck by how different Marcus seemed when he was the one seeking reassurance rather than providing it. The practiced confidence was still there, but underneath it, I could detect genuine bewilderment at my decision to leave. "I didn't misunderstand anything, Marcus. You were very clear about your vision for my future with the firm, and I've decided that vision doesn't align with my professional goals. But starting your own practice, Sarah, that's incredibly risky. You'd be giving up the security of an established firm, the support structure, the shared resources. And frankly, I'm not sure you realize how dependent your client relationships are on the Henderson and Associates brand." The Henderson and Associates brand. Marcus genuinely believed that my clients valued the firm's reputation more than the personal relationships I had spent years building with them. It was a miscalculation that would prove costly, but in that moment, I simply smiled and continued organizing my files. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm confident in my decision. I've thought this through carefully, and I believe independent practice will allow me to better serve my clients' needs." Marcus spent the next 30 minutes trying various approaches to change my mind. Offers of increased compensation, promises of accelerated partnership consideration, even vague threats about non-compete clauses that we both knew were unenforceable in our state. I listened politely to each argument while privately marveling at how quickly his tone had shifted from paternal guidance to desperate bargaining. "What about the Whitmore account?" he finally asked, abandoning all pretense of caring about my career development. "You know that relationship is built on institutional trust, not personal connection. Mrs. Whitmore isn't going to follow you to a startup practice." I set down the brief I had been reviewing and gave Marcus my full attention, letting him see the confidence in my expression before I spoke. "Marcus, I'm not taking any clients with me. I'm informing them that I'm leaving Henderson and Associates and will be available to continue representing them through my new firm if they choose to make that transition. The decision will be entirely theirs but you know they'll follow you, especially Whitmore and Maxwell. Those relationships are personal, not institutional." The admission was everything I needed to hear. Marcus was acknowledging that my client relationships were indeed personal, that my clients were loyal to me rather than to Henderson and Associates, and that my departure would likely result in significant revenue loss for the firm. He was also implicitly acknowledging that his decision to pass me over for partnership had been made despite his awareness of these facts. If my clients choose to continue working with me, it will be because they value the service I've provided them over the past 8 years. I think that's exactly how the legal profession is supposed to work. lawyers earning client loyalty through competent representation and personal attention. Marcus left my office that day with the expression of someone who had just realized that his carefully calculated business decision was about to backfire spectacularly. Over the next 2 weeks, as I worked to transition my cases and notify my clients of my departure, I watched him cycle through the classic stages of institutional panic. First came denial. Marcus convinced himself that my clients would choose to stay with Henderson and Associates once they understood the risks of following me to an untested practice. He had Rebecca schedule meetings with Mrs. Whitmore and Janet Maxwell, confident that her Harvard credentials and partnership status would reassure them about the continuity of their legal services. The meetings did not go as Marcus had hoped. Mrs. Whitmore listened politely to Rebecca's presentation about her qualifications and experience, asked several pointed questions about her familiarity with estate planning for high-net-worth families, and then requested a private conversation with me about the transition process. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Whitmore said once Rebecca had left the conference room, "I'm sure that young woman is very capable, but I've grown quite comfortable with your approach to our family's affairs. You understand our values, our concerns, our goals for the charitable foundation. Starting over with someone new, even someone as qualified as Rebecca, feels rather daunting at my age." I explained my plans for Davidson Legal, emphasizing that I would be able to provide more personalized attention to her family's needs while maintaining the same level of expertise and professionalism she had come to expect. Mrs. Whitmore listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions about my new firm's structure and capabilities, and scheduled a follow-up meeting to discuss the transition process in detail. Janet Maxwell's reaction was even more direct. After listening to Rebecca's pitch about Henderson and Associates' expanded capabilities and institutional resources, Janet turned to me with the kind of no-nonsense expression that had made her a successful manufacturing executive. "Sarah, you've saved my company millions of dollars and helped us navigate some incredibly complex regulatory challenges. Rebecca seems like a bright young woman, but I'm not interested in training a new lawyer on my dime. If you're starting your own firm, I'd like to discuss moving our account to Davidson Legal." The denial phase ended abruptly when Marcus realized that his two largest clients were planning to follow me to my new practice. The anger phase began immediately afterward, characterized by increasingly heated conversations about professional ethics, client poaching, and my supposed ingratitude for the opportunities Henderson and Associates had provided. "This is how you repay 8 years of mentorship and support?" Marcus demanded during one particularly unpleasant encounter in the break room. "By stealing my clients and undermining everything I've built here?" I stirred sugar into my coffee with deliberate calm, letting his words hang in the air before responding. "Marcus, I've never stolen anything from you. I've earned every client relationship through years of dedicated service, and I've never made any representation to those clients other than honest information about my career plans. If they choose to continue working with me, it's because they value the representation I've provided. You know damn well that Whitmore and Maxwell wouldn't have come to Henderson and Associates if you hadn't been here to bring them in. Those relationships belong to the firm, not to you personally." The possessive language was telling. Marcus viewed client relationships as property, rather than professional connections built on trust and competence. In his worldview, my departure was theft, because it deprived him of assets he believed he owned by virtue of employing me. Marcus, client relationships don't belong to law firms. They're built between attorneys and clients based on mutual respect and effective representation. Mrs. Whitmore and Janet Maxwell didn't hire Henderson and Associates. They hired me through Henderson and Associates. If they choose to continue that relationship through my new firm, that's their decision to make. The bargaining phase arrived during my final week at Henderson and Associates, delivered through Linda, who appeared in my office with the expression of someone who had been selected to deliver an ultimatum disguised as a final offer. "Sarah, Marcus has asked me to discuss one more option with you before you make this transition final," Linda began, her discomfort with the message evident in her tone. "He's prepared to offer you immediate consideration for partnership with a vote scheduled for next month. He's also willing to discuss a significant increase in your compensation and a more formal role in business development." I looked up from the boxes of personal items I was packing, struck by the irony of Marcus finally offering what I had earned years ago, now that it was too late to matter. "Linda, I appreciate that Marcus is trying to find a solution. But we both know this offer is motivated by panic rather than recognition of my contributions. If he truly valued my work, he wouldn't have passed me over for Rebecca in the first place. He's also willing to discuss restructuring Rebecca's role to give you more autonomy in managing your client relationships. Essentially, you'd be operating as a semi-independent practice within the Henderson and Associates structure. It, the offer was more generous than anything Marcus had previously considered, but it was also proof that he still didn't understand why I was leaving. He was trying to solve a compensation problem when the real issue was respect, recognition, and the opportunity to build something that reflected my own values and vision. Linda, I've already signed a lease for office space and hired a paralegal. I've made commitments to my clients about the level of service they can expect from Davidson Legal. This isn't a negotiating strategy. It's a career decision based on what I believe is best for my professional future. Linda nodded, her expression suggesting that she had expected this response, but had felt obligated to make the offer. For what it's worth, Sarah, I think Marcus is making a huge mistake in letting you go. You've been the backbone of this firm's client development for years, and I don't think he realizes how much we're going to miss your contributions. Thank you, Linda. That means a lot, especially coming from you. After Linda left, I returned to my packing with a sense of finality that was both sobering and exhilarating. In 3 days, I would be solely responsible for my professional success or failure. There would be no firm structure to support me, no shared resources to rely on, no colleagues to collaborate with on complex matters. There would also be no Marcus Henderson to diminish my contributions, no partnership politics to navigate, and no ceiling on my potential for growth and recognition. On my final day at Henderson and Associates, Marcus made one last attempt to assert control over the situation. He had drafted a farewell announcement that emphasized the firm's institutional strength and continuity while positioning my departure as a natural career progression that wouldn't affect client service or firm capabilities. The announcement was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, managing to simultaneously congratulate me on my new venture while implying that my role at Henderson and Associates had been easily replaceable. Marcus sent it to all clients, professional contacts, and members of the local bar association, apparently believing that the right messaging could minimize the impact of my departure. The strategy might have worked if my relationships had been as superficial as Marcus believed them to be. Instead, the announcement prompted a flood of phone calls from clients, colleagues, and referral sources who wanted to hear directly from me about my plans and how the transition would affect their legal needs. Mrs. Whitmore called within an hour of receiving the announcement, her voice carrying a mixture of amusement and irritation. Sarah, dear, I just received the most peculiar email from Mr. Henderson suggesting that my legal needs would continue to be met seamlessly despite your departure. I'm not sure what gave him the impression that I was concerned about continuity rather than excited about supporting your new venture. Janet Maxwell was characteristically direct. Sarah, I got Henderson's email about your transition. Let me be clear, I'm not interested in seamless continuity with Henderson and Associates. I want to work with you, wherever you're practicing. How soon can we schedule a meeting to discuss moving our account to Davidson Legal? Similar calls came throughout the day, each one confirming what I had suspected but hadn't dared fully believe. My client relationships were indeed personal rather than institutional, built on trust and competence rather than firm prestige. By 5 o'clock, I had scheduled transition meetings with 7 clients representing approximately 60% of the revenue I had generated for Henderson and Associates. Marcus's carefully crafted announcement had inadvertently served as a marketing tool for Davidson Legal, alerting my professional network that I was available for new business relationships. Davidson Legal Services opened for business on a Monday morning in May, operating out of a converted Victorian house 6 blocks from the courthouse. The space was nothing like Henderson and Associates' gleaming corporate offices, exposed brick walls, hardwood floors, and bay windows that let in natural light instead of the harsh fluorescent glare I had grown accustomed to over 8 years. My first client meeting was with Mrs. Whitmore, who arrived precisely on time, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Sarah, this place is perfect," she announced, settling into the comfortable chair across from my desk with obvious approval. It feels like a law office should feel: personal, welcoming, human-scaled. Much better than those sterile corporate towers where you never know if your lawyer actually cares about your case or just sees you as billable hours. Over the next 3 months, Davidson Legal grew with a momentum that surprised even me. Mrs. Whitmore referred her son in law's business partnership, which led to representing two other small businesses in the same industry. Janet Maxwell introduced me to her banker, who needed estate planning services and subsequently referred 3 other clients. My work with the nonprofit boards generated inquiries from other charitable organizations seeking legal counsel. Most satisfying was the realization that my clients were happier with the service they received from Davidson Legal than they had been with Henderson and Associates. Without the overhead and bureaucracy of a large firm, I could provide more responsive service, more personalized attention, and more creative solutions to their legal challenges. The business grew so quickly that I hired a second paralegal and began looking for an associate attorney to help manage the caseload. The revenue projections I had optimistically included in my business plan proved to be conservative. By the end of my 6th month in practice, Davidson Legal was generating more profit than I had ever earned as a senior associate at Henderson and Associates. Meanwhile, Henderson and Associates was discovering the true cost of undervaluing loyalty and competence. Rebecca's federal court connections had generated some high-profile cases, but her lack of business development skills meant that the firm was struggling to replace the steady revenue stream that my client relationships had provided. More problematically, Rebecca's approach to client management was proving incompatible with the kind of personal service that Marcus's clients had come to expect. Her emphasis on legal expertise over relationship building worked well for sophisticated institutional clients, but it was alienating the individuals and small businesses that had formed the foundation of Henderson's practice. Linda called me 6 months after my departure, ostensibly to catch up, but clearly fishing for information about my new practice and its impact on former Henderson clients. "Sarah, I have to ask, are you happy with the decision to go out on your own? I know it must be stressful building a practice from scratch." I looked around my office where family photos sat next to legal treatises and client files were organized in a system that made sense to me rather than conforming to corporate standards. Through the window, I could see the courthouse where I had won my first trial victory and the coffee shop where I met with clients who preferred casual environments to formal conference rooms. "Linda, I've never been happier professionally. The work is more challenging in some ways. I have to handle everything from client development to office management, but it's also more rewarding. I'm building something that reflects my values and serves my clients' needs without having to navigate office politics or justify my worth to people who never understood it in the first place." "Marcus has been asking about you, actually. I think he's finally realizing how much revenue went out the door when you left." "How much revenue?" "Between the clients who followed you and the referrals we're not getting because those clients aren't recommending us anymore, we're looking at about a 40% decrease in our individual client billings. The federal court work Rebecca brought in helps, but it's project-based rather than ongoing relationships." The numbers were sobering, even for someone who had experienced Marcus's decision-making firsthand. He had sacrificed nearly half of the firm's individual client revenue in order to promote someone whose primary qualifications were academic credentials and institutional connections. "I'm sorry to hear the firm is struggling, Linda. I really am. But I can't say I'm surprised. Marcus made it clear that he valued pedigree over performance, and now he's discovering that client relationships can't be transferred like office equipment. The irony is that Rebecca is a good lawyer. She's just not you. Her strengths are in areas that complement rather than replace what you brought to the firm. If Marcus had made you both partners, Henderson and Associates would be in a much stronger position today." The conditional regret in Linda's voice was familiar, the sound of someone who could see the path not taken, but lacked the power to have influenced the original decision. I felt sympathy for her situation, while recognizing that Marcus's choices had created opportunities for me that wouldn't have existed if he had made more equitable decisions. The final confrontation came 8 months after I left Henderson and Associates, at a bar association dinner where Marcus and I found ourselves seated at adjacent tables. I hadn't spoken to him since my departure, but the physical proximity made conversation inevitable. "Sarah?" Marcus said, approaching my table during the cocktail reception with the careful neutrality of someone who was unsure of his welcome. "You look well. I hear Davidson Legal is thriving." Thank you, Marcus. The practice has been very rewarding. I wanted to talk to you about something, actually. Would you have a few minutes after the dinner? There's a business proposition I'd like to discuss. I agreed, curious about what Marcus might propose given the competitive relationship between our firms. After the formal program concluded, we found a quiet corner of the hotel lobby where we could speak privately. Sarah, I'll be direct. Henderson and Associates is interested in exploring a strategic partnership with Davidson Legal. Your client relationships, our institutional resources. I think there could be synergies that would benefit both practices. The proposal was remarkable in its presumption. Marcus was essentially asking me to merge my successful firm with his struggling practice, apparently believing that I would be interested in returning to a subordinate position in the organization that had undervalued me. What kind of partnership are you envisioning, Marcus? Well, obviously the details would need to be negotiated, but I'm thinking about a structure where Davidson Legal becomes a division of Henderson and Associates. You'd maintain autonomy over your client relationships while benefiting from our infrastructure and support systems. And what would Henderson and Associates gain from this arrangement? Marcus's smile became strained, the expression of someone who had hoped to avoid stating the obvious. Access to your client base, obviously, your referral relationships, the stability that comes from diversified revenue streams. The honesty was refreshing, even if the proposal was absurd. Marcus was admitting that Henderson and Associates needed my clients more than I needed their infrastructure. He was also apparently unaware that this admission undermined any argument for why I should consider giving up my independence. Marcus, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in returning to Henderson and Associates in any capacity. Davidson Legal is thriving as an independent practice, and I have no desire to subordinate my business to an organization that demonstrated such poor judgment in its partnership decisions. Sarah, I understand that you feel you were treated unfairly, but business decisions sometimes require looking beyond personal relationships to strategic considerations. Rebecca brought capabilities that the firm needed to grow in new directions. And how is that growth proceeding? From what I hear, Henderson and Associates has lost significant revenue since my departure, while the new directions Rebecca was supposed to enable haven't materialized as expected. Marcus's expression tightened, the careful diplomatic mask slipping to reveal genuine frustration. You took our clients, Sarah. You leveraged relationships that were built using Henderson and Associates' resources and reputation to establish a competing practice. That's not exactly fair play. The accusation was familiar, the same entitled outrage Marcus had expressed when I first announced my departure. He genuinely believed that my client relationships were stolen property rather than earned assets, and he apparently expected me to feel guilty for succeeding with clients who had chosen to follow me. Marcus, I didn't take anything that belonged to Henderson and Associates. I earned those client relationships through 8 years of dedicated service, and those clients chose to continue working with me because they valued that service. If you had valued it as much as they did, we might not be having this conversation. So what was I supposed to do? Ignore Rebecca's qualifications because you had seniority? Make partnership decisions based on client loyalty rather than strategic positioning? You were supposed to recognize that client loyalty is strategic positioning. You were supposed to understand that sustainable success comes from serving clients well, not from chasing prestige and credentials. You were supposed to realize that promoting your best business developer might be more valuable than promoting your most academically impressive associate. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his expression cycling through anger, frustration, and something that might have been regret. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who was beginning to understand the true cost of his decisions. Do you think there's any possibility of rebuilding what we had? Not a merger, not a partnership, just a professional relationship. Referrals, collaboration on larger matters, the kind of cooperation that benefits both practices. The question was tinged with something I had never heard from Marcus before: genuine humility. He was acknowledging, however indirectly, that his treatment of me had been a mistake, and that Henderson and Associates was worse off without me. Marcus, I don't have any animosity toward Henderson and Associates or toward you personally. If the right case came along that required resources I don't have, I'd consider a collaboration. But it would have to be a relationship between equals, not a return to the dynamic we had before. Equals, Marcus repeated, as if testing the concept. You realize that would require me to acknowledge that I made an error in judgment about your partnership candidacy? It would require you to acknowledge that Davidson Legal is a successful practice led by a competent attorney who deserves professional respect. Whether you frame that as an error in judgment is up to you. We parted that evening with a tentative agreement to consider a future collaboration, but without any formal commitments. Marcus walked away with the expression of someone who had finally understood a lesson that had been expensive to learn, while I returned to my table with the satisfaction of knowing that I had claimed my place as his professional equal rather than his grateful subordinate. 6 months later, Marcus referred a complex estate matter to Davidson Legal, acknowledging in his referral letter that the case required the kind of personalized client service that Sarah Davidson has always provided exceptionally well. It was as close to an apology as I was likely to receive, and more than sufficient to confirm what I had known since that morning when I first decided to leave Henderson and Associates. I had built something better than what I had left behind. Not just a more profitable business, but a practice that reflected my values, served my clients' needs, and provided the professional recognition that had been withheld for so long. The partnership that Marcus had denied me had been replaced by something more valuable: ownership of my own professional destiny. Today, as I sit in my office reviewing the quarterly financial reports that show Davidson Legal's continued growth, I think about the choices that led me here. Marcus Henderson taught me an invaluable lesson about the difference between being valued and being valuable, between seeking approval and earning respect, between fitting into someone else's vision and creating my own. Rebecca Martinez earned her partnership at Henderson and Associates through credentials and connections, and she's undoubtedly a competent attorney who will have a successful career. But I earned something more enduring: the knowledge that my professional worth isn't determined by other people's recognition, and the confidence that comes from building success on my own terms. Sometimes the best response to being undervalued isn't to argue your worth. It's to take your worth somewhere. It will be appreciated. Sometimes the best answer to rejection isn't persuasion. It's building something so successful that the rejection becomes irrelevant. And sometimes the sweetest victory isn't proving that someone was wrong about you. It's proving that their opinion never mattered as much as they thought it did. Marcus Henderson chose Rebecca Martinez for the promotion because he believed she represented the future of his firm. He was right about that, just not in the way he intended. Rebecca did represent the future of Henderson and Associates, a future where academic credentials mattered more than client relationships, where appearance took precedence over performance, and where loyalty was assumed rather than earned. I chose to represent the future of legal services, personalized, responsive, and built on genuine care for clients' needs rather than professional prestige. The market has validated that choice every day since I opened Davidson Legal's doors. In the end, Marcus Henderson gave me the greatest gift he could have given, though he certainly didn't intend it that way. By denying me the partnership I had earned, he forced me to discover that I could build something better than anything he could have offered. I didn't need his approval to succeed. I just needed to stop waiting for it.